When my ex-husband sued me for defamation, I didn't panic. I printed out his old messages, slid them into a binder, and mailed them to the courthouse, with a little note that said, "This is just volume 1. He thought suing me would scare me into silence. What he didn't know was that he'd just given me a microphone. The envelope looked ordinary when I first pulled it from the mailbox, nothing fancy, no urgent red stamps, no threatening font, but my hands started tingling the second I saw the return address. It was from his attorney, and somehow I already knew it wasn't about custody, or paperwork, or anything remotely normal. I stood right there at the mailbox, sunlight catching on the edge of the envelope as I tore it open and pulled out the first page. Bold at the top, notice of civil complaint, defamation of character, plaintiff, Douglas Carter. Defendant, Lindsay Carter. I stared at the words for a long time. Part of me was waiting to feel fear, maybe even shame, like he was counting on. But instead, there was this strange calm, this clarity I hadn't felt in years. Because if he wanted to drag my truth into a courtroom, then I'd bring the whole truth. And unlike him, I kept receipts. But I guess I should tell you how we got here, how I ended up standing in my kitchen that afternoon, with legal papers in one hand and my phone in the other, already planning my first call to an attorney. Before Doug became a man who used lawsuits like leashes, he was the kind of person people described as solid and driven. Real estate agent, good dresser, always with a firm handshake and that just trust me grin. We met when I was 26 and still healing from a string of disappointments, the kind you don't admit out loud, the kind you bury behind jokes at dinner parties. Doug made me feel chosen. Needed. Safe. And I mistook that for love because, honestly, I wanted it to be love. I married him a year later. We bought a little home outside Seattle, painted the nursery ourselves, raised 2 kids who lit up the whole damn house with their laughter. On the outside, we were the type of family you'd see on a real estate flyer, polished, photogenic, uncomplicated. But inside, I was unraveling slowly in a silence that never got addressed. It was in the way he'd interrupt me mid-sentence, correcting small things like I was a child who'd misspoken. The way he'd smirk when I shared ideas at a dinner party and then reword them as his own. He didn't scream. He didn't hit. He just chipped away, slowly, expertly, until I started doubting whether I'd ever been whole to begin with. There was a moment that stays with me, even now. It was the week our daughter had a fever and I hadn't slept in 2 nights. I asked him to stay home from work just one morning so I could rest, and he looked at me, without anger, without a raised voice, and said, "I didn't marry you so I could take care of things alone. That's what you're for." I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I needed the moment to pass. I told myself he didn't mean it. That he was tired. That stress makes people cruel. But that sentence carved something into me, something cold and permanent. I stopped asking for help after that. It was about 6 months before the separation when I found the messages. Doug had fallen asleep on the couch, bourbon in hand, phone balanced on his chest, shoes still on like he didn't care what touched what I had just cleaned. I wasn't snooping. I honestly wasn't. But the screen lit up with a notification from a name I didn't recognize, Brianna. It was the kind of message that shouldn't be going to a man with a wedding ring, "Miss you tonight. That thing you said about your wife. Dead on." I picked up the phone and opened the thread. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for, but I found everything. Months of texts, screenshots, late-night selfies. But worse than the flirting were the forwarded messages from me, the things I had texted him, during some of the hardest moments of our marriage. He had sent them to her. My husband had taken the private words I wrote during panic attacks, during postpartum lows, during the nights I stayed up waiting for him to come home, and he'd sent them to another woman, laughing. "This is what I deal with," he wrote once, attaching a message where I'd asked if he still loved me. "She's like a wounded bird," he sent another time. "I tell her to toughen up but she's addicted to sadness." And the worst one, the one that took the breath out of my lungs. "I'm just counting down the years. Once the kids are old enough, I'm gone. She doesn't know that yet." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even wake him up. I just forwarded everything to myself and sat in the bathroom until the sun started coming up, my back against the cold tile, my heart so loud I thought the kids might wake up from it. I didn't leave right away. I know people always ask that, why didn't you go? Why didn't you pack up and run? But the truth is, when you've built your entire identity around being someone's anchor, you don't walk away from the ship just because it's sinking. You think maybe you can patch it. You think maybe if you stay calm, it won't go under. It took me another 7 months. And even then, I didn't explode. I didn't tell the world. I didn't torch his reputation. I let him move into a condo with leather bar stools and novelty bourbon glasses, told the kids it was just temporary, and focused on stability. I stayed quiet, for them, for me, maybe even for him. Until the barbecue. We were at a friend's house, mutual friends, people we'd known for years, back when we were the Carters. Doug had shown up solo, made some offhand joke about being free range now. I kept my distance. I was just trying to help my daughter with her plate and keep my son from knocking over the cooler when I overheard his voice. He was standing with a small group of men by the grill, drink in hand, sounding every bit the confident bachelor. She posted some sappy junk on Facebook, I heard him say. Didn't name me, but come on. Anyone who knows us knows who it's about. I told my attorney, if she wants to play victim, she can do it in court. There was a low chuckle from the group. Doug went on, she always folds under pressure. I mean, it's kind of her thing. She cries, she retreats, and eventually she shuts up. Always does. I didn't drop the plate. I didn't storm over. I just stood there, listening, the ketchup bottle sweating in my hand, and thought, you don't know me at all. That night, after the kids went to bed, I made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. I didn't write anything dramatic. I didn't vent. I just told the truth, carefully, quietly. I wrote about what it feels like to be erased inside your own marriage. To be made smaller, to be spoken for, to be used up emotionally and then told you're fragile. I didn't name him. I didn't have to. The women who read it knew exactly who I was talking about. Because they'd lived it too. The post spread faster than I expected. Comments flooded in, some from strangers, some from women I hadn't seen since college. People thanked me. People cried. People shared it with captions like, this is exactly how I felt but never knew how to say. And then the letter came. The lawsuit didn't frighten me. It revealed him. A man so obsessed with controlling the narrative that he thought he could weaponize the court system to silence the woman he tried to emotionally dismantle for over a decade. And what he really didn't count on, what he had never counted on, was that I kept records. Every message. Every cruel voicemail. Every word he ever typed into a screen, believing I was too broken or too gentle to do anything about it. I took the whole stack to a lawyer named Jenna. She was the kind of woman who wore flats and didn't smile until she meant it. I handed her the complaint, and then opened my laptop to show her the archive I'd compiled. She scrolled silently for several minutes, then finally looked up at me and said, "This isn't a defense." I tilted my head. "What is it then?" She smiled, and this time, she meant it. "It's a wrecking ball." I didn't attend the first hearing. But I watched the courthouse livestream from my laptop and saw Doug straighten his tie like a man about to collect a trophy. He thought my silence meant surrender, and that belief became my greatest weapon. When the lawsuit first began, I did something Doug never expected, I disappeared. Not literally, but digitally, socially, publicly. I took down my social media accounts, deleted my posts, closed my old blog, and sent polite messages to friends explaining that I needed space. I withdrew from everything that fed him information. Within a week, my phone was quieter than it had been in years, the house calm except for the sound of my daughter practicing piano and my son yelling at his video games upstairs. There was no noise, no gossip, no performance left to feed. It was terrifying at first, but then strangely peaceful, like I had finally stepped off a stage I didn't realize I'd been performing on. Doug, however, was thriving in the spotlight I'd abandoned. He began showing up at every possible public event, parent-teacher conferences, charity dinners, Little League games, looking like the poster boy for composure. His shirts were pressed, his shoes polished, and his voice carried that measured warmth that made people say things like, "He's handling this so well." He knew how to play an audience. And now, with me gone quiet, he had the whole town to himself. At our daughter's soccer game one afternoon, I watched from the opposite side of the field as he leaned casually against the fence, surrounded by a small group of parents. His laugh carried across the wind. "You know, I just want to protect my kids from the chaos," he said to someone, loud enough for others to hear. "It's been tough dealing with their mothers, instability, but I'm doing my best." The way he said instability made it sound clinical, factual, like something confirmed by doctors. I kept my eyes on the game, forcing my breathing to stay steady. My son scored a goal, and while Doug clapped like he'd taught him every move, my daughter turned toward me from the field and smiled. I smiled back. That tiny exchange, her looking for me still there, reminded me exactly why I couldn't react. I couldn't afford to give Doug a scene or a soundbite. I had to let him believe I was harmless. Because when you're underestimated, you can build in peace. The first few months after that were an exercise in invisibility. I took on fewer clients at work, told everyone I was focusing on the kids, and spent long stretches at home sorting through old files, reading depositions, and documenting everything I'd ever received from Doug. My lawyer, Jenna, told me we were in the boring phase, discovery, exchanges, the paper shuffle before real movement began. But I didn't mind the monotony. I needed time to think, to regain something that had been dulled by years of trying to manage his moods. At night, after the kids were asleep, I started journaling again, not the delicate kind with gratitude lists and affirmations, but the raw kind, where you let yourself write without caring who would ever read it. I wrote down everything, the silent dinners, the dismissive comments, the way he once told me, "You wouldn't survive a day without me handling the real-world stuff." The ink on those pages became a quiet kind of rebellion. Every memory, every wound, every receipt became something tangible, something I could later use to remind myself that none of this was my imagination. Marla, my therapist, noticed the change in me. "You seem calmer," she said one afternoon as I sat across from her, legs tucked under the chair. "What's different?" I smiled a little. "I stopped fighting to be believed," I said. "Now I'm just watching." She tilted her head. "And what do you see?" I thought about Doug, his careful performance, his curated decency. "A man who thinks the mirror is a window," I said finally. "He's still looking for applause." The first real crack came by accident. One gray Tuesday, I was sitting in the county law library, a place I'd started frequenting under the guise of understanding procedure. Mostly, I liked how quiet it was. No one knew me there, and I could read court records without being interrupted. That's when I saw her, Doug's paralegal, the same one who had smiled at me years ago at his office Christmas party, pretending she didn't know about Brianna. She was talking to someone on the phone near the reference desk, her voice low but sharp. "I told him the exhibits can't include personal messages unless the defense waives privilege," she said, flipping through a binder. "If the judge sees those texts, he'll know Doug's version doesn't line up." I froze. It wasn't just gossip. It was evidence. Doug had submitted something risky, something that contradicted his earlier statements. I listened as long as I could without looking obvious. "I know," she continued, sighing. "But he insists those messages will make him look sympathetic. He doesn't realize how bad they make him sound." My heart began to thud. She closed the binder and walked out of sight, her heels clicking on the tile. I didn't move for several minutes. Then I gathered my notes and left quietly, rain starting to spit against the windows. Doug's own legal team was worried about his messages. The ones that made him look bad. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been quietly cataloging the same thing for years, messages where he belittled me, mocked me, contradicted himself. And now his arrogance was about to do my work for me. That night, I called Jenna. What would happen, I asked, if he submits evidence that contradicts prior claims? She chuckled softly. Then we win without even trying. The weeks that followed were strangely domestic. I cooked more, replaced the curtains, started jogging in the mornings again. Small, deliberate acts that made my house feel like mine instead of the museum of his memory. One evening, as I was making dinner, my daughter looked up from her math homework and said, "Mom, you don't look tired anymore." I laughed softly, stirring the pan. "What do you mean?" "You used to look like you were waiting for something bad to happen," she said. "You don't look like that now." Her brother, always blunt, added, "Dad says you're just pretending everything's fine." "Are you?" I put the spoon down and sat at the table with them. "No," I said carefully. "I'm not pretending. I'm working on making things actually fine." They both nodded, satisfied with that. Kids have a way of cutting straight to the truth. That small conversation reminded me who this was really for, not for revenge, not even for justice, but for peace. Still, I couldn't deny that peace and justice sometimes shared a border. Doug continued his performance, now expanding it beyond the local circle. He gave a small interview to a regional magazine, some puff piece about real estate resilience during personal challenges. He never mentioned me by name, but the quotes were sharp enough to draw blood if you knew where to look. "You learn a lot about integrity when people try to drag your name through the mud," he said. "You just stay classy, stay honest, and let the truth speak." I read it over coffee one morning and almost laughed. The man could lie so smoothly he made it sound like poetry. But that was fine. Let him. Every word he published, every smug sentence, every unguarded comment was another piece of the story that would soon contradict itself. Jenna called me that afternoon. "We've got our first pretrial motion date," she said. "He's pushing for damages and retraction." "Good," I said, flipping the magazine closed. "The higher he climbs, the harder he'll fall." She paused. "You're enjoying this a little, aren't you?" I smiled, but there was no malice in it. "I'm enjoying being underestimated." It was late one Friday night when the Real spark landed. I had been sorting through the last of our shared storage files, those dull digital folders that survived divorces and shared iCloud plans, when I found something that made my stomach turn. A hidden subfolder, buried under his old real estate client database, titled Notes, L. Inside were drafts of messages, voice memo transcripts, and something that made my blood run cold, a draft of a statement Doug had written for his lawyer months earlier. In it, he described me as unfit, accused me of fabricating emotional abuse, and included exaggerated quotes attributed to me that I had never said. It was a fabricated history, a preemptive attack designed to destroy my credibility. But halfway down the document was a paragraph he must have forgotten to delete, a line written in his own words, sloppy and emotional, dated right after our separation. It read, "I know she has the screenshots. I just hope she never uses them. If she does, I'm finished." I sat there staring at it, the house silent except for the hum of the fridge. He had written his own confession, hidden in a file he thought I'd never see. For a long time I just watched the cursor blink on the screen, thinking about how many times he'd called me fragile, dramatic, over-emotional. And then, slowly, I printed the document, slid it into a new folder labeled Final Evidence, and placed it on my desk. The next morning, I emailed Jenna. Subject, found something. Message, he buried his fear in a file named after me. I think it's time we dig it up. She replied 10 minutes later. Then let's start shoveling. And that was the moment the waiting ended. The silence I'd built had served its purpose. It wasn't hiding anymore. It was aiming. Doug's assistant accidentally copied me on an email about how to control the narrative and discredit my mental health. By the time he realized it, the judge had already read every word. That was the moment he stopped looking smug in court. That was the moment he realized this wasn't a performance anymore, it was discovery. The longer Doug believed I'd surrendered, the sloppier he got. He saw me sitting quietly during the online hearings, nodding and whispering to my attorney, and he mistook that for a woman unraveling. It never crossed his mind that I was watching him build my case for me, one arrogant misstep at a time. That's the thing about men like Doug, they think silence is submission. But mine was a vault, locked behind every receipt he forgot I kept. The email was his first real stumble, and he tripped hard. I was at home, scrolling through documents with a dull headache building behind my eyes, when a new message popped up. I didn't recognize the sender at first, just saw my name in the CC line and a subject that read, LC Image Handling Draft 2, Sensitive. My stomach tightened, and I clicked it open. There it was, plain as day. A full internal exchange between Doug's assistant, a PR consultant, and his litigation advisor. They were crafting a campaign to shape public perception, build sympathy around Doug's ongoing victimization, and quietly amplify concern over my emotional fragility. It wasn't just sleazy. It was coordinated manipulation, in writing. The email even suggested, and I quote, subtle social cues that imply instability without triggering legal liability. I read it 3 times. Then I saved the entire thread, screenshotted the headers and timestamps, printed it, and flagged it for Jenna. The irony made me dizzy. In trying to destroy my credibility, Doug had handed me evidence of malicious intent. And in case he deleted it from his server later, I had already backed it up to 3 separate drives. But the true gift? The thread included a planned timeline, social media posts, scheduled interviews, even a coordinated testimonial from a mutual friend who Doug claimed would say I'd been emotionally erratic 4 years. That friend, by the way, had texted me just 2 weeks earlier asking if I wanted to grab coffee. She had no idea what she was being lined up for. The moment Jenna saw the email, she whistled through her teeth. "This is fatal," she said. Not just to the defamation claim. To his entire reputation, professionally and personally. If this hits open court, Doug doesn't just lose, he implodes. I sat back, staring at the document spread across the table. Then let's light the fuse. Doug didn't know yet. He showed up to the next hearing in person, still wearing that same pale blue tie he always wore for court, his serious but sympathetic tie. He waved to the clerk. Winked at his lawyer. And when the judge asked for pretrial disclosures, Jenna slid the printout across the table without a word. I watched Doug read the first page. Watched his eyebrows twitch. Watched his throat tighten. He didn't look up for a long time. After the hearing, I didn't say a word to him. But as I stepped outside, I passed by his assistant, the one who'd made the mistake, standing near a trash bin with her phone in her hand and her face drained of color. She wouldn't look at me. And I didn't need her to. The damage was done. I thought that might slow him down. That he'd take a step back, rethink the smear campaign, maybe even consider backing off the lawsuit. But I was wrong. He escalated. The first sign was subtle. A story leaked in a local newsletter, anonymously submitted, about the toxic ex-wife of a respected local broker. It didn't name names, but it didn't have to. The details matched too cleanly. Her emotional breakdowns, her reckless public posts, the accusations that couldn't be proven. The piece was taken down 2 days later after Jenna filed a cease and desist, but not before it was shared more than 500 times. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. But I did close my laptop and sit in the dark for a long time, breathing, thinking. If he was still going this hard, still trying to scorch my credibility, then something else was coming. I was right. A few nights later, I got a call from my daughter. She was with Doug for the weekend. "Mom," she whispered, her voice tiny over the phone. "Did you tell Dad I'm not allowed to talk about the case?" I blinked. "No, sweetheart." "Why?" "He said I wasn't supposed to ask you questions about it. That you'd get upset." My jaw clenched. "Did he say that exactly?" She hesitated. He said that you're having a hard time telling the truth, and I shouldn't believe everything you say. I closed my eyes and held back the wave of heat rising through my chest. Honey, listen to me. You can always ask me anything. I will always tell you the truth, even if it's hard. And I'm not upset with you, not one bit. Okay? She sniffled. Okay. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with my hands balled into fists. Doug had crossed a line I hadn't expected him to. He was weaponizing our daughter to poison the well. Not just to the public, but to our kids. Jenna's response when I told her was quiet but sharp. Then we bring family court into this, she said. He just turned defamation into something far worse. The fundraiser event came not long after that. I hadn't planned to go. I'd been laying low, avoiding any scene where Doug could corner me or bait me into reacting. But it was for a local youth literacy program I used to volunteer with, and I missed being in spaces where people talked about something other than lawsuits and reputations. I wore black slacks, a warm plum blouse, and no makeup beyond a little lip balm. When I walked in, I saw Doug almost immediately, talking to a real estate developer I recognized from one of his old client deals. He looked tired, the confidence was still there, but it sagged at the edges, like someone patching leaks in a raft that wouldn't stop sinking. We avoided each other at first. I stayed near the back, sipping water, chatting with a few women I hadn't seen in ages. But eventually, he made his way over, his smile tight. Lindsay, he said smoothly. Didn't expect to see you here. I looked him square in the face. That's funny. I expected to see you. He gave a short laugh, but his eyes flickered. Still playing the victim, huh? I tilted my head. Still projecting, huh? He leaned in slightly. You really think the judge is going to buy your little collection of sob stories? I took a slow breath. I don't have to think. You handed over the evidence yourself. For a second, his expression cracked. Just a flicker, but it was real. I turned and walked away without waiting for a reply. He didn't follow. The next morning, I woke up to a message from Jenna marked urgent. Doug had filed an emergency motion overnight, a last-ditch attempt to restrict my custody on the grounds of emotional volatility related to online defamation stress. It was a blatant, desperate move. But it had teeth. If the court had taken it seriously, I could have lost temporary visitation until the trial. I sat at the kitchen table, numb, while the kids still slept upstairs. The sun hadn't even come up yet. He's trying to take them away, I said aloud. My own voice sounded strange in the quiet. When I called Jenna, she didn't mince words. He's cornered, she said. And cornered men get dangerous. But this? This is his final swing. And we're going to end it. She had already filed a motion to strike the emergency claim, citing the fabricated newsletter article, the leaked PR email, the coercive comments made to the kids, and Doug's own contradictory statements from the original complaint. This is it, she said. Get ready. We're filing your countersuit this week. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline. From fury. From the unbearable clarity that this had never been about truth for him. It had always been about control. And now that he'd lost it, he was unraveling fast. As I hung up the phone, my son wandered sleepily into the kitchen. Mom, he mumbled. Can we have pancakes? I knelt beside him and kissed his forehead. Yes, I said. Yes, we can. But first, I printed the countersuit documents Jenna had sent. I read every word, carefully, thoroughly. Then I signed them and placed them in a fresh folder labeled. Final round, let's begin. Doug toasted his fake victory with champagne in the morning. By noon, the judge not only dismissed his lawsuit but handed him a ruling that burned through his career, reputation, and custody claims, all in one stroke. That's what happens when your entire case is built on arrogance and emails you forgot to delete. By the time we reached the final hearing, I no longer felt nervous, not in the way I had during the first appearances. The courtroom wasn't a place of dread anymore. It had become a stage for the truth, and I wasn't afraid of what would be revealed. I had sat through every insult, every smear tactic, every hollow accusation from Doug's side, and instead of reacting, I built the record. Quietly. Relentlessly. Every folder in Jenna's bag was filled with the receipts he gave me himself, signed, dated, and full of the same ego that once kept me silent. Doug arrived that morning as if he were the guest of honor at a tribute dinner. He wore a new charcoal gray suit, carried a stainless steel tumbler that probably held his usual oat milk latte, and greeted the courtroom clerk like they were old colleagues. His attorney trailed behind, face tight. I could tell, someone had warned him. Maybe not everything, but enough to know this wasn't going to be the home run Doug had promised. I didn't look at Doug as he passed. I kept my eyes on the judge's bench and my hand resting on the binder of evidence we'd curated over the past 8 months. Jenna whispered to me as she slid a folder forward. Just let them walk straight into it. And they did. Doug's attorney opened strong, at least, by their standards. He rehashed the emotional abuse claims I had shared online, reframed them as unfounded personal attacks, and argued that I had knowingly and maliciously damaged Mr. Carter's standing as a father and financial professional. He even tried to tie in the emergency custody filing from weeks earlier, suggesting that my public behavior showed emotional instability and a disregard for the legal system. It might have worked if Jenna hadn't been waiting with a surgical counterattack. She stood calmly and asked the judge for permission to enter new evidence into the record. The judge nodded. Jenna opened the folder and began laying out the documents one by one, the assistant's email chain where Doug orchestrated a defamation campaign of his own, the unedited voice recording where he bragged about burying Lindsay legally to a colleague, the calendar entry showing a meeting with the editor of the anonymous newsletter that had published the article attacking me, and finally, the metadata-verified draft where Doug admitted he knew if I ever released our old texts, he'd be finished. In court. When she read that line aloud, you could feel the oxygen leave the room. Doug shifted in his seat. He turned to his lawyer, whispered something sharp, and then, in a move I will never forget, actually stood up without being called and addressed the judge directly. That recording was taken without context, he said, hands raised slightly. It was a private joke. This is being twisted. She's twisting everything. The judge raised one eyebrow and held up a hand. Mr. Carter, you are not permitted to speak unless directed. Sit down. Doug hesitated, then sat, flushed and breathing heavily. Then Jenna added one last document, a declaration from the school principal stating that Doug had, in fact, attempted to plant concerns about my emotional fitness with school staff. The principal included her opinion that she found it inappropriate and potentially harmful to the children's well-being. And just like that, it wasn't just a defamation case anymore. It was a pattern. The judge looked over the materials for several minutes. The silence was agonizing, for Doug. I just sat still. I already knew what was coming. Finally, the judge spoke. This court finds no merit in the plaintiff's defamation claim. Further, the plaintiff's conduct throughout the course of this case, including coordinated media manipulation, intimidation through custodial threats, and bad faith filings, constitutes an abuse of the legal process. Doug's attorney leaned forward slightly, lips parting. The judge kept going. The case is dismissed with prejudice. The defendant is awarded full reimbursement of legal fees, and the court will be referring this matter to the state bar for review of the plaintiff's misuse of legal and custodial systems. Custody agreements will be reviewed separately, and in light of these actions, Mr. Carter's petition to restrict visitation is hereby denied with prejudice. Doug's face was gray. I could see his fingers twitching against the table. For a man who once said I was emotionally unstable, he looked like he might burst into flames. When the judge adjourned the session, he left the bench without another word. Jenna leaned over and whispered in my ear. That's not just a win. That's a warning shot. I nodded slowly. I didn't need to gloat. He had undone himself, and everyone saw it. Outside the courtroom, Doug tried to corner me. He was walking faster than I expected, almost tripping over his own briefcase. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low, too sharp to be casual. I turned to face him. "You said that once before," I replied. "Right after I left. Remember what happened next?" He blinked at me, lips parting. "I stopped running," I said. "And you started losing." His lawyer finally pulled him away before he could say anything else. I didn't rush home after court. I walked across the street to the little coffee shop on the corner and sat by the window with a tea. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel like I was bracing for another blow. There was no next hearing. No pending motion. No smear post waiting to go live. Just me. A woman who had told the truth and lived long enough to see it confirmed, not just online, but under oath. The court deposit for my legal fees hit my account 4 days later. Jenna called me as soon as the check cleared. "I just deposited a check signed by Doug Carter," she said, clearly enjoying the irony. Amount, $83,421. I exhaled, slowly. "Paid in full. And he's got a disciplinary review hearing scheduled," she added. A few former clients came forward after the court transcript leaked. "Seems like he's got more fires than water." I said nothing at first. Then, softly, "It's amazing what you see once people realize they're allowed to speak." 2 weeks later, I took the kids to the fall festival downtown. It was the first time I'd brought them to a public event in months without worrying about who might whisper or stare. My daughter wore her favorite oversized hoodie. My son insisted on trying 3 different pies at the dessert booth. And that's when I saw it, the first true social crack. Doug approached a group of colleagues near the food trucks, but one of them turned his back before he arrived. Another woman gently stepped away, pretending to answer a call. Only one man nodded politely, and that was it. No smiles. No pats on the back. Just cool silence and avoidance. Doug's eyes met mine across the lawn. I didn't smile. I didn't flinch. I just turned to my kids and said, "Let's go check out the hay maze." And we did. The final sting came 3 weeks after the festival. Jenna forwarded me an article from a regional legal blog. Doug's brokerage license had been formally suspended pending review. The state board cited abuse of legal proceedings to suppress non-criminal speech as one of the key ethics violations. They also mentioned the anonymous PR smear campaign, which, according to the blog, was under separate civil investigation. I stared at the headline for a long time before forwarding it to myself. Not to post. To keep. Because sometimes revenge doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be thorough. The kids and I baked cinnamon rolls that Sunday. Flour on the counters, music playing low, my daughter dancing barefoot in the kitchen while my son focused way too hard on the frosting. And I stood there, watching them, thinking about the years I spent afraid that no one would believe me. That my voice wouldn't matter. That the truth would stay buried under charm and manipulation and all the ways Doug made people question their own judgment. But in the end, he couldn't lie fast enough to outrun the facts. And I didn't need to shout. I just needed to prove it. They thought they'd buried me. All they really did was clear the field. And I planted something that'll outlast every word he ever tried to erase.